Daddy, listen to me. Edward Lancaster froze at the nursery doorway, his blood running cold. For 2 years, his daughter Clara had not uttered a single word, her silence declared incurable by the most expensive specialists in Manhattan. Yet now, as the evening sun spilled through lace curtains, he saw her small hands resting on the piano keys, while Naomi Williams, the housekeeper he had hired out of desperation, played a gentle melody. And then it came, the impossible sound of Clara's voice, singing in perfect French, clear and angelic. Edward's chest tightened. Millions spent on therapies, countless diagnoses, every report calling her broken, and here she was, singing as if her silence had been nothing but a choice. "What trick is this?" he roared, his fury shaking the room. Clara's voice faltered, her blue eyes widening in fear as she pressed herself against Naomi's arm. Naomi rose slowly, her expression calm, but her heartbeat racing. "Mr. Lancaster, I can explain." "Explain?" Edward stormed into the room, his shadow falling across them like a judgment. "Explain how a maid succeeds where the best doctors failed? Explain why my mute daughter suddenly sings as though she's been hiding a secret life?" His voice echoed, filled with disbelief and pride, wounded deeper than any wound money could heal. Clara's small lips trembled, and Naomi placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. For the first time in 2 years, the child whispered, "Please, Daddy, don't be angry." The sound shattered the air like glass, leaving Edward breathless. Was this a miracle or betrayal? And if your child spoke after years of silence, would you believe it? Or would you suspect the person who brought that voice to life? Tell me, what would you do? Edward's fury filled the nursery like a storm, his polished shoes striking the wooden floor with the weight of his indignation. Naomi remained still, her hand gently resting on Clara's trembling shoulder. Clara clung to her housekeeper as if Naomi were the only safe harbor in a world that had turned cold and unrecognizable. "I demand the truth," Edward barked, his eyes narrowing, his pride bruised by what he had just witnessed. Naomi's voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had faced tempest before. "Sir, Clara has always been able to speak. She chooses when and with whom." Edward scoffed, a sharp, bitter laugh slicing through the room. "Nonsense. She is 6 years old. The doctor said selective mutism, neurological disorder, permanent limitation. And now you, just a servant, claim to cure her in mere weeks? Do you take me for a fool?" Clara shifted, her little hands clutching Naomi's skirt, her eyes darting between the two adults like a bird trapped between predators. Then, with a courage that surprised even herself, she stepped forward. Her voice, fragile yet resolute, rose above the tension. "Daddy, I talk. I just don't talk to people who don't listen." The words struck Edward like a blade. He staggered, blinking as though the world had tilted beneath him. He had heard nothing from his daughter but silence for 2 endless years. Silence that he had come to believe defined her. Yet here she was, speaking with clarity, with judgment, with a truth so simple it cut deeper than any accusation. "Impossible," he whispered, his lips pale. "You don't understand, Daddy," Clara continued, her small voice growing stronger, steadier with every word. "You asked the doctors what's wrong with me, but Naomi asked me what I think, what I feel. You never asked me." Naomi's eyes glistened, pride swelling in her chest as she watched the little girl break chains stronger than iron. Edward's heart clenched, but not with tenderness. It was rage mixed with terror. If what Clara said was true, then he had failed not only as a father, but as a man who prided himself on control. He shook his head violently, rejecting the possibility. "You've poisoned her mind," he spat at Naomi. "You've manipulated her into defiance." But Naomi did not flinch. "No, sir, I listened. That is all." Clara reached for her father, her small hand trembling. "Daddy, I want you to hear me. I can sing, I can learn, I can speak. I am not broken." Edward's chest rose and fell like a caged beast, his instincts demanding denial, even as his soul quivered under the weight of her words. He had spent fortunes to fix what was never broken, and now the truth threatened to unravel the fortress of pride he had built around his heart. For a fleeting second, he saw her not as a defect, but as a child, bright and alive, begging to be acknowledged. But his pride was an unforgiving master. He turned his gaze cold as marble. "Enough!" he barked. "This charade ends now." Clara's face crumpled, her newfound voice faltering, but Naomi held her firmly, whispering encouragement. The room pulsed with a silence far heavier than before, the silence of a father choosing denial over love. And deep within Edward, a war began, one he was determined not to lose, even if it meant silencing the very miracle he had just witnessed. Edward's face hardened into stone, his eyes dark with the fury of a man who refused to be challenged in his own home. Pride and fear swirled inside him like poison, and he could not bear the thought that this woman, this housekeeper, had exposed the cracks in the fortress of authority he had built. Clara's fragile voice still echoed in his ears, but instead of softening him, it ignited a fire of defiance. He would not be defeated by a child or by the woman who dared to suggest he had failed. "You're finished here, Naomi," he said coldly, his voice like a judge delivering a sentence. "Pack your things and leave. You will not spend another hour under my roof." Clara gasped, her small hands clutching at Naomi's dress with desperation. "No, Daddy! Don't send her away! Please, she's the only one who understands me." Her cries pierced the air like a bird's scream trapped in a cage. But Edward's heart was deafened by arrogance. He ignored her pleas, his eyes locked on Naomi, daring her to resist. Naomi's chest rose slowly, but her face remained calm, her hands steady against the storm. "Sir, please reconsider," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion rather than fear. "This is not about me. This is about your daughter." But Edward's pride was immovable. "Do not presume to lecture me about my child," he snapped. "You have filled her head with dangerous illusions. I will not allow it. She will forget you." Clara began to sob uncontrollably, her tears staining Naomi's skirt, her small body trembling as though the world were collapsing around her. "I don't want a new nanny. I don't want anyone else. I want Naomi," she screamed, her voice breaking through the silence of 2 years only to be crushed under the weight of her father's cruelty. Edward stepped forward, his jaw clenched, and tore Clara away from Naomi's embrace. The child fought with all her strength, her nails scratching, her legs kicking, her cries filling the halls of the grand mansion. But Edward's grip was iron, unyielding. He carried her down the hallway while she screamed Naomi's name, her voice echoing against the marble walls. Naomi stood frozen, her heart breaking as she watched the girl disappear into the distance, her sobs fading only when the heavy sound of a door slamming shut reverberated through the house. Edward returned moments later, his face untouched by remorse. "You have 10 minutes to leave," he said, his tone dripping with finality. "If you refuse, security will remove you." The cruelty in his voice was colder than the steel gates outside. Naomi inhaled deeply, steadying herself, refusing to let him see her pain. She knew this was not the end, but Clara's anguished cries burned inside her like fire. Edward mistook her composure for defeat, but he did not see the quiet determination building behind her calm eyes. Clara's voice had been born tonight, and no force, not even her father's wealth and power, could silence it forever. As Naomi gathered her belongings, she glanced once more at the locked door upstairs, where Clara wept alone. She whispered a silent promise, a vow only her heart could hear. This would not be the last time Edward Lancaster underestimated her, and it would not be the last time Clara's voice would rise. For in that cruel dismissal, Edward believed he had won, but in truth he had planted the seed of his greatest undoing. Naomi walked down the long marble hallway with deliberate steps, each echo of her heels a reminder that her time in the Lancaster mansion was ending. But she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured far worse than the disdain of a wealthy man. Clara's cries still rang in her ears, cries that tore at her heart. Yet beneath the sorrow burned a flame of resolve. Edward thought he had dismissed a servant, but what he failed to see was that he had pushed away a woman who carried with her the truth. And truth has a way of returning louder than any command to leave. In the privacy of her small quarters, Naomi collected her few belongings: a worn leather bag, a stack of books in child psychology, and most importantly, a box of recordings. For 2 months, she had carefully documented Clara's progress, not as a scheme, but as part of her lifelong dedication to understanding children who had been misunderstood. Each tape held the sound of Clara's brilliance, her singing in Italian, her attempts to write small poems, her observations about the stars from the nursery window. These were not the sounds of a broken child, but of a gifted one hidden beneath her father's shadow. Naomi placed the final cassette in the box and paused, her eyes glistening. "One day, Clara, the world will hear you," she whispered. She zipped her bag and stepped back into the hallway where Edward stood waiting, arms crossed, his face carved with triumph. 10 minutes, he reminded her coldly. Naomi lifted her chin, her calm gaze meeting his without flinching. "You may silence me in this house, Mr. Lancaster, but not in the world outside it." His lips curled into a mocking smile. "Do you really think anyone will believe the word of a maid over mine?" Naomi's expression did not change, but her voice carried a quiet warning. "Sometimes the voices you dismiss are the ones with the power to undo you." Edward bristled, fists tightening, but Naomi walked past him without another word, each step steady as though she carried not just her belongings, but Clara's unspoken promise. Outside, the night air was crisp, the city lights of Manhattan glowing in the distance like beacons. Naomi drew in a deep breath, remembering her own childhood in Brooklyn, the daughter of a cleaning lady and a bus driver. She had been underestimated all her life, told she was destined for smallness, yet she had risen through sheer determination, earning her degree in child psychology, mastering languages, dedicating herself to understanding the fragile brilliance of children who suffered in silence. People like Edward Lancaster believed wealth was power, but Naomi knew better. Knowledge was power, and truth, once revealed, was unstoppable. In her modest apartment across town, Naomi laid the recordings on her desk, arranging them like puzzle pieces of Clara's hidden genius. Hours slipped away as she reviewed her notes, her heart breaking with each memory of the child who had trusted her enough to open her voice. Clara had shared secrets in whispers, how lonely she felt, how she pretended to be weaker than she was just to win her father's fleeting attention. Naomi closed her eyes, pain tightening her chest, but also conviction. This was not just about saving a child. It was about confronting the arrogance of a man who believed love could be replaced with diagnoses and control. A knock at her door startled her. It was Daniel Rivera, the lawyer she had contacted discreetly. He stepped inside, his expression grave as Naomi showed him the box of evidence. "This isn't just neglect," Daniel murmured after listening to a recording of Clara singing with flawless pitch. "This is a case that could expose how easily power can hide the truth." Naomi nodded. "I don't want vengeance. I want justice for Clara. I want Edward Lancaster to see his daughter for who she truly is." Daniel looked at her with respect, sensing the fire behind her calm demeanor. "Then we'll make sure her voice is heard." And as the night deepened over the city, Naomi felt the weight of her secret transform into strength. Knowing the battle ahead would not be easy, but determined that Clara would never again be silenced. Back inside the Lancaster mansion, the silence was suffocating. Clara sat curled up in her room, her small arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes swollen from hours of tears. The grand space that once echoed with music and whispered stories now felt like a prison, its golden frames and velvet drapes unable to disguise the loneliness of a child abandoned in plain sight. Edward told himself he had restored order, but in truth he had silenced the only voice that mattered. To him, Naomi was gone, dismissed like all the others before her. But what he could not admit was the echo of Clara's words still haunting his mind. "I don't talk to people who don't listen." He tried to drown the memory in financial reports and meetings with advisors. But pride is a poor shield against a guilty conscience. Within days, Edward hired a new governess, Margaret Holloway, a woman in her 60s with impeccable references and a reputation for discretion. She arrived with polished manners and quiet efficiency, the perfect candidate for a man who valued appearances above all. Edward introduced her coldly to Clara, who did not speak, did not even lift her eyes from the floor. Margaret tried gentle words, tried to coax a smile, but the child remained locked away in silence, her gaze distant, her spirit withdrawn. At dinner, Clara pushed food around her plate without eating, And when Edward scolded her, she simply stared as though he were a stranger. Margaret watched carefully, sensing what others had missed. This was not a child who could not speak, but one who would not, and the difference revealed more about the father than the daughter. Meanwhile, across town, Naomi poured her energy into what she now called the Clara Project. With Daniel Rivera's legal guidance and Dr. Eleanor Hayes' academic support, she compiled recordings, transcripts, drawings, and notes, building an undeniable case that Clara was not only capable, but gifted. Night after night, Naomi sat at her desk, listening to the tapes of Clara's laughter, her stories about the stars, her songs sung with haunting purity. Each recording was a reminder of the promise Edward had refused to see. "This will change everything," Dr. Hayes told her after reviewing the files. "It's not just about one child, it's about how prejudice blinds us to brilliance." Naomi's heart ached with both hope and fear. She knew Edward's influence was vast, his lawyers ruthless, but she also knew the truth carried its own power, and she believed in Clara more than she feared Edward. Back in the mansion, cracks began to show. Margaret, experienced and observant, noticed the patterns. The way Clara recoiled at Edward's presence, the way her silence deepened when he entered the room, the way she scribbled notes instead of speaking. One evening, after another failed attempt to make her eat, Margaret whispered, "Sweetheart, you don't have to talk, but I want you to know I'm here to listen." Slowly, Clara picked up a napkin, wrote in neat, careful handwriting, "Is Naomi coming back?" Margaret's heart tightened as she read the words. She looked at the child and answered gently, "I don't know, darling, but I do know you are very special." Clara managed a faint smile, then wrote again. Naomi knew that. Margaret tucked the napkin into her pocket, her resolve quietly growing. Later that night, as she sat in her room reflecting on the child's pain, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Hello, Margaret. This is Naomi Williams. I know you must sense the truth. Clara needs help. If you wish to speak, I am here." Margaret stared at the message, her pulse quickening. She looked toward Clara's room, where the girl had fallen asleep clutching the napkin. For the first time in her long career, Margaret felt torn between duty to her employer and responsibility to the child before her. The mansion's polished walls no longer looked strong. They looked fragile, ready to collapse under the weight of the truth pressing from within. The day of reckoning arrived not with thunder, but with quiet inevitability, as though truth itself had grown too heavy to remain hidden. Edward Lancaster awoke to a string of messages that unsettled even his hardened composure. A notice from Child Protective Services requesting a welfare assessment of his household, a missed call from his personal lawyer urging immediate consultation, and finally a letter marked with the seal of Columbia University's Children's Rights Center, inviting him to attend a press conference at 3 o'clock sharp. He dismissed it at first as a nuisance, but beneath his polished exterior, his hands trembled. By early afternoon, he found himself seated in a crowded auditorium, the air thick with anticipation, scholars and journalists whispering, cameras ready. At the podium stood Dr. Eleanor Hayes, her presence commanding, yet gentle, a figure of authority shaped not by wealth but by wisdom. "We are here today," she began, "to present the extraordinary case of a child whose true abilities were hidden beneath misdiagnosis and neglect." Edward stiffened, his jaw tightening. He tried to appear unconcerned, but when the first recording played, his facade began to crack. Clara's voice filled the room, pure and unrestrained, singing in Italian with a precision that silenced every whisper. Gasps rose from the audience as the recording shifted to her discussing mathematics far beyond her years, her childish lilt unable to disguise brilliance. Edward's heart hammered in his chest. He remembered those very moments, nights he had dismissed as meaningless noises from the nursery. Then came the words that gutted him. Clara's small voice recorded with heartbreaking clarity, saying, "Daddy always talks to the doctors like I am not there. He says I am a lost cause, but Naomi listens. She tells me I'm smart." Edward felt the blood drain from his face. He had spoken those words in the privacy of his office, thinking no one heard. Now the entire room heard. The projection screen lit up with documents, medical reports signed by Edward, letters pressuring therapists to maintain diagnoses that justified his narrative of a disabled child. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the audience like waves. Dr. Hayes continued with surgical precision, unveiling every detail of Naomi's documentation. Drawings Clara had made, musical scores she had composed, pages of reflections showing emotional awareness far beyond her age. Edward's world collapsed piece by piece, his identity as a powerful father dismantled in front of strangers. Finally, Naomi stepped to the podium, not triumphant but steady, carrying a thick folder. She spoke without bitterness, her voice warm, yet unyielding. "For 2 months, Clara entrusted me with her voice," she said. "She told me how she hid her abilities to gain affection, how she pretended weakness because she believed it was the only way her father would see her. She is not broken. She never was. She is extraordinary." Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled, and Edward sat motionless, a man exposed. His lawyer whispered for him to remain silent, but inside Edward battled a storm of humiliation and grief. He wanted to shout that this was betrayal, that Naomi had manipulated his child, but the evidence was undeniable. Even more damning was Margaret Holloway's quiet testimony. She spoke as a professional with decades of experience, her voice trembling only slightly as she described Clara's isolation, her refusal to eat, her desperate written question. "Is Naomi coming back?" The words pierced deeper than any accusation. Edward buried his face in his hands, for the first time unable to summon anger as his defense. The conference ended with a standing ovation, not for Naomi or Dr. Hayes, but for Clara, whose drawings and songs were projected on the screen in tribute. Reporters rushed forward, questions flying, but Edward could hear only one thing, his daughter's voice echoing in his mind, whispering with devastating simplicity, "I just don't talk to people who don't listen." 6 months later, the Columbia University auditorium was filled with applause as Clara Lancaster, only 6 years old, stood proudly on stage receiving a Medal of Honor for academic excellence. Her golden hair shimmered under the lights, her small frame radiating confidence as she bowed and thanked the professors in perfect French before switching seamlessly to Italian. The same child once dismissed as mute now glowed with brilliance, her voice unshaken, her spirit unbroken. In the front row, Edward Lancaster sat motionless, tears streaming down his face. Pride and shame warred within him, but when Clara stepped down and whispered, "Daddy, are you proud of me now?" the weight of his arrogance finally gave way. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though afraid she might disappear, and whispered back, "I've always been proud of you, Clara. I just had to learn how to see it." Nearby, Naomi Williams watched quietly, her eyes misting, not from victory but from relief. She had never sought to destroy Edward, only to save Clara, and in the process she had reminded a powerful man of the humility required to be a father. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood beside her, proud of her protege who had turned painful documentation into a movement that challenged prejudice in parenting. Even Margaret Holloway smiled warmly, her earlier doubts transformed into respect for the resilience of both child and caretaker. Edward approached Naomi after the ceremony, his voice low, broken, stripped of pride. "Naomi, I am sorry." She placed a hand gently on his arm. "Don't be sorry to me. Be the father she deserves every day. That will be enough." The forgiveness embedded in Clara's innocent eyes had already begun the healing, proving that sometimes the greatest redemption comes not from punishment, but from love reclaimed. The story of the Lancaster family became a quiet legend whispered among parents and teachers, that the greatest treasure is not in wealth or reputation, but in the fragile voice of a child asking to be heard. And now I ask you, do you believe every child deserves to be truly listened to, no matter how small their voice? Tell me in the comments what this story means to you.